Studying from 2 Samuel chapter 11. But before we go to 2 Samuel chapter 11, I think it's good to bring to our minds a few passages from the New Testament that will help us as we study this morning. One of those is Romans chapter 3 and verse number 23. Romans 3 and verse 23. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. In Acts chapter 13 and verse 22, as the Apostle Paul is preaching to a group of Jewish people in Antioch of Pisidia, he gets to a point in his sermon where he mentions King David, David of Bethlehem of the Old Testament. And he quotes from the Old Testament saying this about David, that he was a man after God's own heart. And yet we always need to keep before us Romans 3 and verse 23. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Even David of Bethlehem. Even this man referred to as a man after God's own heart. A second passage from the New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse number 13. There hath no temptation taken you, but such as man can bear. But God is faithful, and will with the temptation make also the way of escape. God is faithful, along with temptations that come our way. There's always a way of escape provided by God. Perhaps you'd like to turn with me now to the book of James, James chapter 1. I think what we're going to study this morning illustrates well this passage from James chapter 1. James 1 and beginning at verse number 12. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempteth no man. But each man is tempted when he is drawn away by his own lust and enticed. Then the lust, when it hath conceived, bringeth forth sin, or beareth sin. And the sin, when it is full grown, bringeth forth death. God doesn't tempt us, but temptation comes when our lust is flamed and enticed. So let's go now to 2 Samuel chapter 11. 2 Samuel 11, and we'll start reading at verse number 1. It came to pass at the return of the year, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried at Jerusalem. In ancient times, at this time in history, it was common practice for war, military hostilities for the most part, to cease during the wet, rainy season of winter. And that's what has happened here. There was a time that the army of Israel had ceased from military activities, but now it's the return of the year, the spring. The winter rains have ceased, the weather is better, and the Bible tells us this is the time when kings would lead their armies into battle. But David doesn't do that here. Instead, he sends his top general, Joab, to once again go fight against not the Philistines, but this time they're engaged in conflict with the children of Ammon, the Ammonites. David sends Joab and the army, and David stays behind. When we studied from 2 Samuel chapter 7 the past couple of weeks, we noted that it was a time in the life of David when he was well settled on the throne. It was a time of relative peace and well-being for the nation as a whole. He had had a palace constructed for himself. He was firmly established in his new capital of Jerusalem, and things were well. When you go to 2 Samuel chapter 8, you see further enumeration of David's victories, of how God was with the army of Israel, and David was successful in these military campaigns. And now it's once again time for battle. It's once again time for the king to lead the soldiers into battle. But he doesn't do that. He sends Joab, and David tarries. He stays behind in his palace in Jerusalem. I think what we have before us here is a picture of complacency. It was much more comfortable for David to be in his palace in Jerusalem than out besieging a city of Ammon. He could enjoy the comforts of home. No doubt he had full confidence in Joab that Joab could handle the task at hand. Complacency is set in. He stays behind. How oftentimes for us today as Christians are we more susceptible to temptation? How often does temptation tend to come our way when we're complacent and comfortable and at ease? Everything's all right. The tendency is to let our guard down. And we're going to see David face temptation. Things are comfortable for him, and he becomes complacent. How many times do we face temptation when we're not doing what we're expected to do and we're not where we're expected to be? David was expected to be leading his army. He was expected to be on the battlefield. He wasn't where he should have been, and he wasn't doing what he should have done. In verse number 2, 2 Samuel chapter 11. It came to pass at eventide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. Let's pause there. It's toward the evening. It's almost dark. David gets off his comfortable bed. Perhaps he's restless. Whatever reason, he goes out on the roof of his house. And at that point in time, he looks out over his house to a neighbor's house. And he sees a woman in the evening taking a bath. A very beautiful woman. A woman beautiful to look upon. And here's where the temptation begins. This desire within David, this desire within all men, a beautiful woman to look upon. One thing we need to consider and always remember is that with the legitimate desires that God has created us with, God has provided a way for that desire to be fulfilled. One commentator noted that at this point in time, David had a harem, a collection of at least 20 women among his wives and concubines. Of course, God's ideal was one husband and one wife, not one husband and many wives. But there was a multiplicity of women that David legally, his point in time, his point in history, could have went to. He could have gone to a wife. But instead, his desire that's present here, it becomes enticed, becomes inflamed. And that desire, we'll see, turns to lust. A few years ago, a publication entitled the Discipleship Journal conducted a survey among its readers. And part of the survey dealt with things that were spiritually challenging to them, things that they were tempted by. The survey respondents came back and said things like materialism, pride, self-centeredness, sexual lust. All of those things made the top 10 of things that were challenging to these readers spiritually. But also, these readers were asked, well, when you're faced with temptation, how do you combat that? What do you do to equip yourself to resist, to fortify yourself to overcome temptation? And here's what the readers said. 84% said that prayer helped them resist temptation. 84% said prayer. 76% said avoiding compromising situations. In other words, more than 3/4 said, I'm able to resist temptation. I'm able to avoid temptation if I keep myself out of situations where I know I'm going to be tempted. Avoid compromising situations. 66% said that Bible study helped them avoid and resist temptation. 52%, over half, said that being accountable to someone else, being able to go to someone else and talk to them, say, I'm facing this temptation. 52% said that's helpful, that's useful in allowing me to resist temptation. And think at this point in 2 Samuel chapter 11, if King David had done any of those 4 things. What if as he walked out on his roof and he saw this woman, this very beautiful woman, what if at that instant, that point in time, he turned around, gone back inside, perhaps gone back to his bedroom and kneeled down to pray? What if he had taken the time, instead of continuing to look on Bathsheba, this beautiful woman, what if he had looked away and meditated on the Scriptures? What if he had thought about the 10 Commandments? What if he had called to mind Exodus chapter 20 and verse 14? Thou shalt not commit adultery. God's word, the law of Moses, was very plain. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Crystal clear. What if David had had the mindset, the fortitude to think on God's word? Just walking away, avoiding this situation, going away, back inside, getting his mind off of it, that would certainly help. What if he'd called the prophet Nathan in and said, I saw this beautiful woman bathing, and here's what it caused me to think. What if he had talked to that man of God, Nathan? Surely Nathan could have helped him in that time. But the Bible doesn't tell us that David did any of those things. What did he do? Verse number 3. He pursues what he has seen. And David sent and inquired after the woman. And one said, Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? And David sent messengers and took her. She came in unto him, and he lay with her. For she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned unto her house. Verse 5, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David and said, I am with child. Perhaps because of his complacency, as he looks down on this woman taking a bath, his desires inflamed, becomes lust, he's enticed. Instead of resisting, he pursues. Who is this woman? And someone says, well, that's Bathsheba. She's the daughter of Eliam. She's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And the Bible tells us that this Uriah was one of David's mighty men, one of his soldiers that he could count on in the fiercest battle. This is Uriah's wife, one of your mighty men. Her name is Bathsheba. So David sends people and takes Bathsheba. She's brought to the palace, and adultery's committed. In the course of time, she understands that she's with child, and she sends word to David, I'm pregnant. We see as we continue reading that Uriah, at this point in time, wasn't at home. In fact, he was where David should have been. As a mighty man, as a soldier, he was in Joab's army. He was fighting against the Ammonites. We'll see also that this man Uriah was a man of integrity. When David's told, this is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, well, he knows where Uriah is. He knows that Uriah's in the army, that he's in the field fighting. So an opportunity presents itself. And that night, with his lust enticed and inflamed, he brings this woman, and adultery is committed. And she's with child. Now what? David has a problem. Bathsheba has a problem. Today, it's perhaps fashionable to refer to adultery as having an affair. And if this happened today, we would say David had an affair with Bathsheba, or David and Bathsheba had an affair. And if it was a political leader today, it would be somewhat scandalous, perhaps not as much today as just a few years ago, but it would still make headlines. But there's more to what's happening here than just a political scandal. David realizes that what's happened isn't good. But I'm not sure his conscience is pricked. And I'm not sure he's feeling guilty because he's committed adultery. The law of Moses was very plain. Thou shalt not commit adultery. But also, the law of Moses was very plain that adultery was a capital offense. Leviticus chapter 20, verse number 10. And the man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with another man's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. So in committing adultery, David and Bathsheba have committed under the law of Moses a capital offense. The just punishment for such was that for both David and Bathsheba to be put to death. Well, David's the king. David's popular. Surely the people wouldn't have this carried out. But as we continue, we're going to see that Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, was a man of surpassing integrity. When confronted with his wife being with child, knowing he wasn't the father, would he press the situation? Would he press to the point, Bathsheba, who is the father? Bathsheba, who have you committed adultery with? If she offers up David, then what? Would Uriah press the point? Would he take it to the elders? David, even though he's the king, he's committed adultery. Would he do that? Was that in David's mind? Whatever David was thinking, he's motivated to conceal. He's motivated to try to cover up and hide what's happening. How many times when we commit sin do we try to do the very same thing? Try to keep people from finding out. Try to hide what's happened. The very first sin, when sin enters paradise, the Garden of Eden, what did Adam and Eve do? They tried to hide. They tried to make clothes out of fig leaves. And God has to ask, not for his benefit, but to press the point to Adam. Adam, where are you? He tried to hide. We ought to remember the 23rd verse of Numbers 32. Numbers 32:23, be sure your sin will find you out. Even if we're able to conceal, cover, somehow hide our sin from other people, God already knows. He saw that the very night adultery was committed, God knew what David and Bathsheba had done. There was no way to conceal it from him. There was no way to hide it from God. They were guilty of adultery, and God knew that. But notice what David tries to do, starting in verse number 6. David sent to Joab, saying, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. And when Uriah was come to him, David asked of him how Joab did, how the people fared, and how the war prospered. And David said to Uriah, go down to thy house and wash thy feet. And Uriah departed out of the king's house, and there followed him a mess of food from the king. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and went not down to his house. David has a plan to cover up his adultery with Bathsheba. She's with child, so he has Uriah recalled from the battlefield. And he brings Uriah in, one of his mighty men. He asks, well, how's Joab doing? How is the battle going against the Ammonites? And Uriah answers those questions. And David says, Uriah, tonight, why don't you wash your feet? Why don't you get cleaned up and go home? The idea being you can spend the evening with your wife, Bathsheba. I'll even send along some food from the palace, a wonderful dinner for Uriah to enjoy at home with his wife. What did Uriah do? Verse 9. He slept there at the gate, at the door of David's house. He did go home. Verse number 10. When they had told David, saying, Uriah went not down into his house, David said unto Uriah, Art thou not come from a journey? Wherefore didst thou not go down into thy house? And Uriah said unto David, The ark and Israel and Judah abide in booths, and my lord Joab, and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open field. Shall I then go into my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As thou livest, and as thy soul livest, I will not do this thing. We see Uriah has the heart of a soldier. He has a heart of integrity. David's plan's unraveling. Uriah didn't go home like he was supposed to. He didn't even see his wife. Uriah, why didn't you go home? You've been on a journey. You've been in battle. Why didn't you go home and see your wife? He says, well, Joab and all the soldiers, the Ark of the Covenant, they're either in tents or sleeping in the open battlefield. That's where my duty is. That's where I'm supposed to be. How can I enjoy the comforts of home when all that's going on? Verse 12. David said to Uriah, Tarry here today also, and tomorrow I will let thee depart. So Uriah abode in Jerusalem that day and the morrow. Verse 13, David has one more plan, one more chance. When David had called him, he did eat and drink before him, and he made him drunk. And at even he went out to lie on his bed with the servants of his Lord, but went not down to his house. David says, Uriah, you stay one more day, spend tomorrow night also in Jerusalem, and then you can go back to the army. Then you can go back to the battle. And David takes an opportunity that night as they eat to ply him with alcohol, to get him drunk, perhaps hoping that with his senses impaired, being drunk, that he'll go home and be with Bathsheba. But even impaired, verse 13 tells us he didn't go home. He didn't go to his house. But once again, he slept with his servants at David's house. Now what? The problem that David's concerned about hasn't been solved. What to do now? We see a progressive and a compounding aspect to sin. The very first verse of Psalm 1 talks about that. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of Jehovah, and on his law doth he meditate day and night. A progressive, compounding aspect of sin that weighs us down. The picture there in Psalm 1 and verse 1, a man walking. He's walking by this situation he shouldn't be in. But then he stands, he lingers, and finally he takes his seat among that. And we see that here with David. He committed adultery. He's tried to cover it up. He's tried to conceal it. He's tried to hide it by bringing this woman's husband home. That hasn't worked. Now what? David, maybe it's finally time to deal with this situation in a way God would approve. But no. We see sin compounded by more sin. Verse 14. It came to pass in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote in the letter, saying, Set ye Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, and retire ye from him, that he may be smitten and die. And it came to pass when Joab kept watch upon the city, that's Rabbah, that he assigned Uriah unto the place where he knew that valiant men were. And the men of the city went out and fought with Joab. And there fell some of the people, even of the servants of David, and Uriah the Hittite died also. Then Joab sent and told David all the things concerning the war. And he charged the messenger, saying, When thou hast made an end of telling all the things concerning the war unto the king, it shall be that if the king's wrath arise, and he say unto thee, Wherefore went ye so nigh unto the city to fight? Knew ye not that they would shoot from the wall? Who smote Abimelech, the son of Jerubbesheth? Did not a woman cast an upper millstone upon him from the wall, so that he died at Thebez? Why went ye so nigh the wall? Then thou shalt say, Thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. David's plan to conceal and cover up and hide has failed. So now he conspires, in essence, to have Uriah murdered. Not just Uriah, but there are others that lose their life in this instance. The day David sends Uriah back to the battle, he writes this letter. Joab, I want you to put Uriah in the spot of the most fierce fighting. And as that occurs, draw back from him so that he will be killed in the battle. And that's what Joab does. Remember, they're laying siege to this city. But on David's orders, they go to a spot. Joab sends Uriah to a place where he knows the most valiant, the most brave, the most courageous among the Ammonites will be there, and fighting ensues. Uriah and others are killed. So Joab sends this message, this account of this particular battle back to David. And he knows that the report of the loss of life and this immediate defeat would not be pleasing to David. So he says, he puts in the message, he tells the messenger, if David starts to become angry and starts to present all the reasons why Joab was a bad leader in this particular situation, that he's cost soldiers their lives, then he tells the messenger, all you need to say is, your servant Uriah is dead also. That way David will know that Joab has done what David told him to do. Verse 22. So the messenger went and came and showed David all that Joab had sent him for. And the messenger said unto David, the men prevailed against us and came out unto us in the field, and we were upon them even unto the entrance of the gate. And the shooters shot at thy servants from off the wall, and some of the king's servants are dead. And thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Then David said unto the messenger, thus shalt thou say unto Joab, let not this thing displease thee, for the sword devoureth one as well as another. Make thy battle more strong against the city, and overthrow it, and encourage thou him. David is told and realizes that this plot is successful. His previous attempt to cover it up by bringing Uriah back, that didn't work. But in David's mind, this time, his plot, his plan worked. Uriah's been killed. And so, under the guise of seeming to be concerned about the war, the battle, it says, tell Joab not to be discouraged. Tell Joab not to get too upset. These things happen in wars. People die. Encourage him. Let Joab know that I'm still confident in him, that they can take the city. That they may have lost this particular battle, but they're going to take the city. They're going to win the war. David thinks that his problem is solved. The last two verses of the chapter. And the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead. She made lamentation for her husband. And when the morning was past, David sent and took her home into his house, and she became his wife and bare him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased Jehovah. David thinks that his problem is solved. Now that Uriah has been killed in battle, this honorable man, this military hero, there'll be a period of mourning. And Bathsheba will appropriately mourn her husband for the allotted period of time. And then as we read, I can bring her, she can become my wife, and this child that's been conceived, that will be my son. Problem solved. The very last sentence. The thing that David had done displeased Jehovah. Next Sunday morning, we're going to continue. I want you to read the very next chapter, 2 Samuel chapter 12. And then along with that, read one of the Psalms. I want you to read Psalm 51. What David has done in committing adultery and conspiring to commit murder, indeed, those things are displeasing to God. There will be great, long-lasting consequences that David and his house are going to have to suffer. We read about those consequences in the next chapter, chapter 12, and the chapters that follow. But also, we're going to note there's a high cost associated with sin. There's a high cost associated with redemption and forgiveness. One thing we'll see is that even though we can be forgiven and redeemed, many times there's still consequences that will have to be faced. But with God, there is the possibility of forgiveness, of salvation and redemption. But we'll see that forgiveness, that redemption, indeed comes at a high cost. As chapter 11 ends, David mistakenly thinks everything's okay. He solved the problem. It couldn't be further from the truth. So next Sunday morning, 2 Samuel chapter 12 and Psalm 51. And I said next Sunday morning, actually it'll be 2 weeks from this Sunday. Next Sunday morning, our lectureship will begin, and we'll have a lecture at the 9:30 hour in here. So 2 weeks, we'll continue 2 Samuel chapter 12, Psalm 51. We'll take a break now and get ready for the worship hour.